Welcome, everyone. Very glad to have you join us tonight. I'm keeping track of how many people are still in the waiting room and how many are coming in. I'm just going to ask that you give us a few moments to sort of let people gather before we jump into tonight's event. There were many, many people signed up, which is not at all a surprise. And Joe, I'm going to let you cue me for when you think we've given people enough time to come in.
Sure, I'll let you know. I think we've still got
Okay.
a filtering in, and then I'll
Great.
get it.
People from around the world, I'm quite certain. Hello, everyone. We're just giving more folks time to join us, and we'll be starting in just a few minutes.
All right, it looks like we're slowing down a little bit, so I think you're probably good to go whenever.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Sormanti, and I have the distinct pleasure of being the host for tonight's exciting narrative medicine rounds. On behalf of the Division of Narrative Medicine here at the Columbia University Irving Medical Center, I want to welcome those of you who are joining rounds for the first time, and of course, those of you who have joined us before. Narrative medicine arose at Columbia more than 2 decades ago now, and is now what I think we can fairly say is an international movement. And it lies at the intersection of humanities, the arts, clinical practice, and healthcare justice. Our narrative training is intended to equip clinicians to humbly comprehend their patients' experiences and their perspective so that they can be sure to deliver equitable, top quality, effective care. One of the things that we are spending more and more time focusing on, as I said, is healthcare justice. That underlies everything that we do here. Our writing, our teaching, our research, advocacy work, and of course, our delivery of care. And our community assembles every month for these rounds. And we do that because we are increasing our own knowledge as we do that, and our partnerships with more and more of you who join these events, and to really fortify our commitment to a just and effective healthcare future. Before I introduce our speaker, I have been asked to mention a few basic Zoom ground rules, just so that our program goes as smoothly as possible. And I'm going to go through them very quickly because I too want to get to our speaker. The first thing, if you could please keep your microphone muted just to cut down on any background noise during the program. I also should note that if there are any disruptions, sometimes there's noise behind you that you didn't expect, or if there are any inappropriate comments in the chat that you might be removed from the event. During the talk, we're also like to ask you to keep your chat interactions to a minimum. There will be a Q&A as part of the event. And as we get closer to that part, we're going to invite you to submit questions into the chat. So if you could save them until then. The event's being recorded, and all of you who've registered are going to get the link for it today or in the next few days, and you can share it as you wish. And captioning, if you haven't seen already, is available during tonight's program. Finally, at the end of our program, we'll put up some links to online bookstores where you can order books, including our speakers' books, and find out more information about our speaker and about the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics and the Program of Narrative Medicine. So now the fun part. Introducing our distinguished speaker. Judith Herman, MD, is professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School for 30 years until she retired, although it doesn't seem to me that her retirement is very restful, very busy. She was director of the training program at the Victims of Violence program at the Cambridge Hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She's the author of groundbreaking work, award-winning books, including Father-Daughter Incest, which was published in 1981, and Trauma and Recovery, published the following year in 1992. She's the recipient of too many awards to list here. I'll name a few: a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1984, and then in 1996, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. In 2007, she was named a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Her new book, which I have had the pleasure of reading, is called Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. And it was published in March 2023. So Dr. Herman, I'm going to hand it over to you, and just to say that we are very fortunate to have you join us here tonight. So welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. The spirit of narrative medicine seems to be close to my heart, particularly the part about listening to patients, because I think, and listening with a social justice lens, or I guess you don't listen with lenses, but you know what I mean. That's really what launched my career, because at the same time as I was doing my psychiatric residency, which began in 1970, I was in a radical feminist consciousness raising group. And consciousness raising really taught me how to listen, more so than I would say my psychiatric residency did. And Kathy Amatnik, a classmate of mine who coined the term consciousness raising, saw it as both a method of political organizing and a method of scientific inquiry. She had been a civil rights worker during Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. And she had seen there in the freedom schools that SNCC organized how bringing people together to tell their stories gave people courage. And so the same methods were applied in the women's liberation movement. The first 2 patients I had as a beginner on my first month on an inpatient rotation were women who gave histories of father-daughter incest. And at that time, the received wisdom in the psychiatric texts was that the prevalence of incest was 1 case per million. So if that were the case, what do you suppose the chances were that a rookie would see 2 cases in a month? And the other thing I found was that when you actually listened to what these patients had to say, and they had been admitted to the hospital after making serious suicide attempts, what do you know? They got better. So that kind of was the springboard for everything that has come since. So let's, and most recently, I was able, during COVID, I live in an assisted living residence, and we were pretty much in lockdown for 2 years. And I had this project on the shelf. And I figured, well, it's now or never. And so, you know, why waste a good pandemic? And so here's the latest. And I really start with a power analysis of 2 different kinds of relationship that are found throughout the world, throughout history, and at every level of relationship, from the most intimate realms of sex and family life to businesses, to the nation state, to international relations and the, you know, international organizations of business and crime. And so I just, for simplification, call these the rules of tyranny. And they are very simple. The strong do what they please, the weak submit, and the bystanders look the other way. Either that or they collaborate because they know which side their bread is buttered on. And under such circumstances, there may be courts, there may be laws, but there is no justice. And basically crimes of the powerful are crimes of impunity. And for that reason, and because patriarchy is the most prevalent form of systemic dominance and subordination worldwide and in history, we actually have now a special rapporteur on human rights on violence against women. And they basically report that impunity is what rules, and they urge that perpetrators need to be brought to justice. But in fact, does that happen? Only in rare cases. These are data from 1990s in the US. And as what you see here is an exponential decay curve. And I didn't update this slide because it's basically unchanged in 30 years. And these are maximum estimates for sexual assault, which in some ways is the least complicated form of patriarchal violence. Only, something under 30%, probably more like 20% of cases are ever reported to authorities based on prevalence. And we do have good prevalence data now. And when you then get to cases cleared by arrest, prosecuted, convicted, and resulting in a prison term, you're under 5%, probably more like 1%. So if you're committing sexual assault in the US, your odds of getting away with it are pretty much 99% out of 100. In contrast, here are the rules of mutuality, or the rules of democracy, and these are the rules of equality. Everyone deserves respect, deserves a voice. Decisions are made by negotiation and consent. And relationships are governed by principles of fairness. And if you look at philosophers of justice, which I did a bit of for this book, or even if you look at dictionary definitions of justice, pretty much the word fairness comes up all the time, and fairness predisposes equality, that, or at least mutuality. I think justice also predisposes an idea of a moral community in which everyone is bound by a mutual moral code. The same laws, the same morals apply to everyone. And when that trust is violated, the community is expected to mobilize to support the victim and to hold the perpetrator accountable. Here I'm quoting from a writer named Ross London, who in his legal career has been a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a municipal judge, and who's sort of writing about how restorative ideas might improve our justice system. But he says that, you know, it makes, justice demands action from the community. It means that people have to rally and share the victim's demand for justice. Otherwise, the victim is the one who is ostracized, shamed, and isolated. And for this book, I interviewed 30 survivors of various forms of gender violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, childhood abuse, sexual trafficking, domestic violence, 26 women and 4 men. And I asked them, if you could design what justice looked like, what would it be? I mean, it seems like such an obvious question to ask, but nobody ever asks it. This is the listening issue. But what I heard from many of the people I interviewed was that the betrayal of the bystanders, the betrayal of the community, hurt worse than the hurt worse than the actual crime. And that was true whether the betrayal was the family or whether the betrayal came from the justice system. And here's a quote from a woman who was sexually assaulted at a party by someone she met at a party during her freshman year at college. Very high risk time, by the way. And actually did this was one of those 20% that, or 20 to 30% that went to the police, filed a complaint, named the perpetrator. But the DA didn't want to go forward because it was an acquaintance rape, which most sexual assaults are committed by people known to the victim. And so it was going to be he said, she said, and in our criminal justice system, DAs are judged by how many wins they get. And so she didn't want to take the case. And that felt like a terrible betrayal. Another person I interviewed, I should say, by the way, that of my 30 informants, about half had actually sought justice in the criminal or civil system. And that's, of course, a much higher percentage than in the general population. But most of them had not been happy with their experiences. And here's a survivor of domestic violence who basically said, just throw your illusions about justice out the window. I sometimes say that if you wanted to design a system, a social organization that would be guaranteed to exacerbate the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, a court of law would fill the bill nicely, because what victims need and what the justice system requires are often diametrically opposed. And here you see the contrast. Victims need safety, first of all, for recovery, but going to court increases risk. They need acknowledgement rather than a challenge to their credibility. They needed to be treated with respect and dignity, but they often find the justice system experience humiliating. They need to be able to assert some control over their how they tell their story and when and to whom, but that's not going to happen. They, rather than a narrative, they have to respond to being peppered with questions. And instead of limiting exposure to triggering reminders, they have to have a face-to-face confrontation. Nevertheless, I think many more survivors would be willing to go through with this if the outcome was what they really wanted, but it's not. The outcome that the criminal justice system offers is punishment. Civil justice system offers money. And neither of those was what my survivors said they most wanted. But they wanted the community to rally, to prevent this, to acknowledge and denounce the crime and prevent it from happening again, to set whatever limits were needed on the perpetrator to prevent a repeat. So here's a kind of summary of what I heard from my 30 informants. The three in red are things that everybody agreed on. I mean, there was a lot of, not everybody agreed on everything by any means. There was a lot of variability, and I should say there was a lot of diversity in this group in terms of class background, ethnic and racial, sexual orientation, religious background, geographic origins. They were more high, as you would imagine, for a convenience sample where I just put out the word to people I knew that I was looking for people to interview on the subject. They were more highly educated than the general population. Everybody wanted acknowledgement. That was number one. Not just the facts, but the harm. And they wanted acknowledgement from the community, even more than they wanted it from the perpetrator. And they wanted the community to step up and say this was wrong. They wanted the community to say, you didn't deserve this. And really to have the burden of shame lifted from them and placed on the shoulders of the perpetrator. People were very mixed about whether they wanted an apology. More people, again, wanted apologies from the bystanders than they did. A lot of them wouldn't trust an apology from the perpetrator. They were mixed about wanting restitution. Some people said, I've spent so much money on medical bills, therapy bills, lost time from work, having my career derailed. I could use some money, and other people felt like that would be dirty money and I don't want to touch it. They did want, they pretty much said that most of them wanted name prevention of future harm. And in fact, the 6 out of the 30 that actually went through a whole criminal trial to a conviction said that they did it because they couldn't live with themselves if he did it to somebody else. And they wanted the offender contained and exposed. They wanted him deprived of positions of power where he could, take advantage of his power to be a predator. But they weren't big on punishment. Most of them didn't see what good punishment was going to do for them. And they weren't big on revenge. A lot of them were tormented by revenge fantasies. We'll talk about that a little more. But they didn't like them. It felt like sort of a foreign body. This isn't me. I'm having these, vicious, fantasies, and it doesn't feel like, it felt like the violence of the perpetrator and the hatred had been was a foreign body that they couldn't get rid of. They were also not big on forgiveness. And we'll talk a little more about why. So here's just some quotes about acknowledgement. This is what he did to another human being. So the exposure of the perpetrator. Another survivor who had been trafficked by her abusive father when she was a child. And again, she just felt like, I want them to realize I'm a human being, not a drugged underage body. And I want their families to know. They wanted the bystanders to have to recognize who these folks were. Ross Chait, a professor who, as a boy, was sexually abused by the choir director in a boys' choir, and had delayed recall as an adult, had dissociative amnesia, as many abused kids do, and then delayed recall. It was too late. He got corroboration from many other boys in the choir, what people had been in the choir with him. But it was too late for criminal charges because of the statute of limitations. But But he did file a civil complaint both against the perpetrator and against the choir for covering it up. When the judge put a dollar value on of $500,000 on the complaint, he felt incredibly relieved and vindicated, even though he knew he was never going to see the money. I mean, that guy didn't have a lot of money, and he had, you know, hightailed it out of the state by that time. And so he wasn't going to see the money, but he felt that didn't matter as much as just the idea that money showed that the judge valued him. Here's a work of art by a woman named Amy Bradford, who was raped by a man she had dated after she broke up with him. And she was tormented by the revenge fantasies she had. So she did a painting of her, imagining shooting him. And then you see the crying face, and behind this, the background is all the victims of gun violence in Massachusetts for a year. So this was her way of saying, I have these fantasies, but I don't like them. Interestingly, her husband was much more comfortable. He'd been in the military, he was an attorney, he was much more comfortable with his revenge fantasies. And I found that to be true often with family members, that they are not so conflicted about their wishes for revenge. But even I asked him, well, what if the guy really apologized? And he said, well, wait a minute. He said, I'm tired of being angry. I'm surprised to hear myself say that. It was like a little light bulb went off. And when there is a true apology, that there is kind of a magic to it. But the problem is that many of the survivors I spoke to didn't trust that they saw the sociopathy, they saw the narcissism up close, and they. Here's a quote from someone saying, I think he'd get a kick out of, he'd love to go into all the details of what he did. He probably, and I'd feel slimed. And if he did apologize, then the family might want me to forgive him. And that's a real problem for survivors, because from the moral community's point of view, it's a whole lot easier to pressure victims to forgive than to actually do the hard work of holding perpetrators accountable. So here's another survivor who was a minister's daughter, was a very practicing Christian, but she said, no, he needs his creator's forgiveness. He doesn't need my forgiveness. And I'm glad I don't have any role in that. This Protestant minister who was a survivor of domestic violence and now works with clergy to try to raise their awareness about domestic violence and not counsel their parishioners to turn the other cheek, or stay in the relationship to keep the family together. She quotes one victim saying, I turned the other cheek and turned the other cheek, and now I have no face left. And she said, we need to be thinking about moving perpetrators' contrition and changed behavior. And the truth is, we have no clue about how to do that because punishment has been our default. And because most people who commit these crimes are, you know, as one judge put it, fine young men, or not so young, we don't want to punish them. And as far as restitution goes, again, here's a quote from someone who didn't want money directly from the perpetrator, but she said if it could be, if it could come from the community itself, that would feel right. And in fact, I just want to call your attention, for those of you who may not be aware of this, to the fact that we do have such a mechanism in the US. It was passed under the Reagan administration as a sort of law and order measure, but it actually, I see it as a very progressive act, because it set up a trust fund in which perpetrators as a group could give back to victims as a group. And so it doesn't matter whether your particular perpetrator has money or not. You don't have to deal one-on-one with, and also this money has been used, and survivors sit on the boards, and national and statewide, that allocate these funds. And they go to direct victim compensation, to funding victim advocates in the courtroom, and to funding crisis intervention centers like rape crisis centers and battered women's shelters. There's an argument to be made that we as bystanders, we the taxpayers, should also be kicking in, but that hasn't happened so far. Here's a quote from the late British philosopher Bernard Williams that talks about how when the community rallies to share the victim's anger, it helps transform helpless rage and shame into righteous indignation. Helpless, when you want revenge, is when you feel helpless rage. George Orwell wrote a wonderful piece long ago called "Revenge is Sour." But when you feel righteous indignation, you feel pride rather than shame. And that can be a motive for joining with others to make things better, for action, for constructive rather than destructive action. So that's kind of it. This is a poster from National Crime Victims' Rights Week, because there is now an office for victims of crime in the Justice Department and a National Center for Victims of Crime. And we have National Victim Rights Week. In Massachusetts, we've had for many years a conference at the State House during Victim Rights Week. And so here's, I think, a poster that really captures a lot of what my informants said, they want to be honored rather than shamed, supported by the community rather than ostracized and blamed or ignored. So they want justice, but that means support, voice, resources, information, participation, advocacy, restitution, counseling, safety, respect, and voice. So I'll leave it at that, and the floor is open for questions, comments.
Dr. Herman, I want to thank you so much for this really thought-provoking work that you've done, and for sharing what the 30 people, largely women, shared with you about their experiences and what they think justice would mean for them. I know that I'm going to encourage folks, if they haven't already, to put some questions into the chat. And I think Joe and or Kristen are going to help me with those. I don't actually see them at the moment, but I also want to, I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that, at least as a member of the Columbia community, the university community here, I'm a bystander of sorts to abuses that have happened and come to light fairly recently. So the timing of your presentation, unfortunately, couldn't be better for us here.
Yeah.
And I think there are people that are, I don't want to sidetrack us. There are people, I think, who are trying to follow the roadmap that I think you've begun to set out for us.
Well, you are not alone. I mean, every institution has these issues, because, I mean, the good news is that most people don't abuse their power, but some people do.
Some people do.
And by the way, I should say, I chose gender violence because that's what I know best. But this is true of any system where the dominance of one group over another is deeply ingrained in the society, whether that's because of race or religion or any other characteristic.
Thank you for that. Joe or Kristen, can you, if there are any questions that folks have, I don't know if people are taking in everything that was shared tonight. Boy, okay. The questions are starting to come in right now, Dr. Herman. Let's see. Somebody
First one
asked.
is, how do you cope with your identification with your patients?
Great question.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. Say that again.
It was a question from Jean Donnelly, was thanking you and asking, how do you cope with your identification with your patients, with receiving this?
Oh, yes.
Working with, yeah.
Yes, I mean, and this is true for all bystanders, all witnesses, but certainly for clinicians. Never do it alone. That's what I tell all my colleagues and students. You've got to have your own support system, because you think you've heard everything, and you never. Somebody will tell you a story that you just couldn't imagine in your wildest dreams that one human being would do to another, and it just makes you sick to your stomach, and it gives you, we get vicarious trauma. And so we need to have our buddies. We need to have the people whose shoulders we cry on. We also need to have, and by the way, when you have a support system or people who are trying to bear witness and make change, you sort of also see the best of what people are capable of. My mother, who was a psychologist and psychoanalyst, and political activist, used to say that activism is the antidote to despair. That was one of her pearls. And I think, but you also need your pleasures in life. You need your, the things that bring you joy. And you need to take care of yourself. And, this is such a vast problem that the more you can join together with others, and whether that's for music or parties or walking the dog, hiking the trail, you need to breathe.
I think sort of related to that answer, somebody, Ella, has asked if you have any resources that you might recommend for undergraduate students who are looking to serve as peer support for survivors, or just simply becoming more educated about trauma-informed support.
Well, that would be a great thing to offer as to all undergraduates at any kind of institution of higher education. Northwestern University, I had some examples in my book of, ideas about, particularly for college campuses, because I thought college campuses would be a great laboratory for innovation here, both because the kids are in the demographic of highest risk, the 18 to 24-year-old group is at highest risk. The second highest is 12 through 17, by the way. So if you make it to 25 and you haven't been sexually assaulted, your odds get better. But also, the college education is a privilege, not a right. And so the college is entitled to set certain rules of conduct, like, you can't plagiarize and you can't cheat on exams, and that sort of thing. And I think college campuses are also a very good place for to offer restorative accountability mechanisms, because hopefully you're catching offenders when they're young. Maybe they are still trainable. Their frontal lobes haven't fully developed, and maybe you can train their football team and their frat while you're at it. But Northwestern has a very nice peer counseling program, and they train a bunch of peer counselors every year, both to do educational programs and to respond to individual survivors. And apparently the kids love the class, even though they don't get course credit for it. So, but I think offering a class with course credit would be even better. And so their educational program isn't, as one of my informants said, it's not just don't drink at parties. It's they have a play they put on during orientation week called The Student Body, and they enact scenarios, and then they have small group discussions, and they, you know, they have bystander intervention training, and they have a little educational van that goes around the campus called Find the G-Spot. And they give out condoms and morning after pill and sex, you know, so they really do sex education, because you have to assume that your college students are getting their sex education from porn. And porn is all about, as Catherine McKinnon defined it long ago, the eroticization of dominance and subordination.
There are lots of questions still, but I want to highlight one that seems particularly important at the moment. Somebody begins with a comment that many of us who are survivors were extremely triggered and set back in our healing process with the rise of Trumpism and multiple accounts of sexual assault committed by the ex-president being given a pass. Practically a stamp of approval, this person writes. How does a clinician counter the damage that's done by those extremely powerful people?
Well, again, I think it's a great question. And again, I think people can't do it alone. So, I mean, I think the activism is the antidote to despair issue or advice pertains to survivors as well. Now, you know, if you're in crisis, if it's a recent assault or, you know, a recent incident that, you know, brought it all back, that's not the time. But, you know, you have to have your own safety first and your own defensive perimeter. And then the processing of the trauma. But when people are ready to think more about present and future, and from a proactive stance rather than a purely defensive stance, I think that's the time to sort of reach out and get involved in some form of social action. And it was a study that was done back in the 1970s by a psychiatric nurse, Ann Burgess, and a sociologist, Linda Holmstrom. They volunteered to be on call 24/7 at Boston City Hospital for every rape victim who came to the emergency room. And they interviewed the victims at the time and gave them support. And then they did a follow-up study 4 years later. The best the things that predicted good recovery were being able to take action, some form of action, didn't matter what, whether it was getting a dog or just changing the locks on your, or moving in with someone who felt protective, taking action and joining with and finding support from others. And so these were people who reached out and told someone, and if the first person they told wasn't supportive, they didn't give up, they tried until they found a supportive person. And so the worst recoveries were seen with people who remained isolated. And the absolute best recoveries were seen with about 10% of the survivors who developed what my colleague Robert J. Lifton calls a survivor mission. He's a psychiatrist who interviewed the Hiroshima survivors of the atomic bomb. And he said, you know, some of the people who made meaning out of their survival by saying, the only reason I'm still alive is to tell the world what, you know. The folks who developed a survivor mission did very well, whether it was going to a speak out or public education or testifying before the legislature to change laws or whatever it is, you know, who said, if I could prevent this from happening to one more person, it won't have been totally in vain. And so I think you can encourage that kind of coping with your patients, because they're not going to solve it in the consulting room one-on-one. It's a political problem.
Thank you for that. I hear your radical feminist roots are still very strong within you, which is fantastic.
That sustained me for all these years.
That's fantastic. And I hope that you have, I'm sure that there are other radical feminists in the audience, but I hope that new ones will be sparked here from your conversation. I know we're coming close to the end of the hour. Joe, do you think we have time for one more question or not?
Okay, maybe one more. Yeah.
Okay. Can you choose one that you can access?
There was one that that caught my attention. Let me see if I can just scroll through and find it again. This is from Molly Dickerson. I know the secondary re-traumatization a lot when talking to people, particularly women with chronic illnesses. The societal, medical, or community dismissal or disbelief of invisible illnesses or trauma can be just as traumatizing as the illness itself. What societal philosophies underlie these tendencies to dismiss it or ignore when terrible things happen to someone? Along with the patriarchy and ableism and all these systems of oppression, I found that people subconsciously in our culture believe that, quote, good things happen to good people, quote, because it gives them a false sense of security. And I think this contributes to victim blame.
Well, I think you just answered your own question. Yeah, people, you know, if it can happen to you, can it happen to me? You know, people really don't, you know, would rather not think about it if they don't have to. And that's true of all of us, I'm afraid. But again, if you have the reward of facing it is that you can do something about it.
Well, I hope that everybody, I'm sure, there were many thank yous in the chat, and I'm sure many more that haven't been written into the chat. But I want to thank you personally on behalf of us here in the narrative medicine community for taking the time to be here tonight. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to say I'm happy to be here and thank you for having me.
Well, we'll try to have you back at some point again.
Okay.
Great.
Have a good evening, everyone.
You too. Thank you for your presentation. I just want to thank everybody else for joining us tonight and remind you that there will be a recording of tonight's event that you should expect to get via email in the next couple of days, and that we hope we see you again next month on November 1st. We have another exciting presentation by a photographer, a writer and curator, Marvin Heiferman, who will speak to us about grief and its work through photography and representation. So we'll see you all then. Have a great night, everyone.